During the recording of this video, the microphone glitched out at multiple parts. I've done my best to minimize and re-record the most egregious instances, however, it still shows up throughout the video. Apologies in advance. The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Ages, and Oracle of Seasons are interesting to say the least. Two games that were developed with the specific intention of representing a core aspect of Zelda. According to these games, what Zelda fundamentally is are puzzles and action, though I would argue that Seasons is more specifically about the adventuring side of the Zelda series since I don't get that action vibe while playing the game, but I digress. They were also developed by Capcom, the only non-Nintendo developers to make games in the mainline series. They also happen to be my favorite Game Boy games ever made, not including Advance because I'm not that cringe. I believe wholeheartedly that they don't get enough recognition for what they do well when played individually, separated from their other half, which I think greatly diminishes the great aspects of both of these games. So in this video, I'll try to keep them separated as much as possible. I'll do a bit of comparing and contrasting throughout to further show the value of these games individually and how their design philosophies affect how they're designed with each other, but for the most part, everything else will be kept exclusive. Now begins the Oracle of Ages and Seasons retrospective. Oracle of Seasons looks pretty dang good for a Game Boy game. The sprite work is pretty solid, everything is appealing to look at, the visuals are nice, I'm running out of things to say. It's just hard for me to really talk about how any sprite-based game looks, especially in regards to NES and Game Boy games. They do a pretty good job at adapting the art styles from A Link to the Past in the original game and making something look kinda cool out of it for the hardware they had to work with. What else is there to say? The music, on the other hand, is kind of average. I like their adaptation of the series' main theme, but pretty much all the original tunes are mostly just serviceable. They do what they need to do, but there isn't a single original track from either game that I listen to outside of the context of the game. So, this game is focused on the action-y, adventuring aspects of the Zelda series, and to be honest, I don't really have as much to say on it, same with both games actually, but I will try my best. The main mechanic at play here that they believed would help sell the idea of the game being focused on this side of Zelda is switching between the different seasons. Changing seasons affects how you interact with objects and the environment. It doesn't affect the whole map, but I don't really think that it needs to. It mostly just sees you having to remember which season you need to switch to on your way over to a tree stump, usually 4 or so screens away. It's a pretty fun mechanic overall. With that being said, I do think that while switching seasons is fine enough for what this game is going for, I do think Oracle of Ages' time travel is far more interesting and well utilized than season switching. It's not a fault of this game, just an area that I don't think quite hits the mark as well as its counterpart. You never need to switch seasons in a dungeon, and no substantial portion of overworld progression is locked behind it. I'm not too bothered by this though, as the game more than makes up for it by virtue of how big the focus on exploration is. The overworld is fairly easy to navigate, and once you gain the ability to swim, it really opens up to you. It's arguably the most open game in the series in between the original game and A Link Between Worlds, which is why calling it strictly an action game has always confused me. I guess there's a larger focus on combat in the dungeons, but it's not like there's as big a focus on combat in the overworld or anything. Regardless, the progression of this game is pretty dang solid no matter what you decide to call it. There are fewer roadblocks, which allows for a ton of freedom to do things in the order that you want to do them, which is something I never see anyone talk about. Then again, I don't ever really see anyone talk about these games to begin with. There are a ton of secrets and goodies sprinkled all throughout the map, and they're generally a lot better at being discoverable than in the original Zelda, which means that the pacing is usually set by how you decide to play the game. As someone who thoroughly enjoys the exploratory elements of Zelda, I usually spend a lot of time in the overworld of this game, mostly because of how free it feels to move through, especially in comparison to Oracle of Ages, though I'll get to that in the next section. Going any further when talking about the overworld would probably get really repetitive, so I'll just leave off on the note that I think the overworld is by far the strongest element of Seasons. Not the only good element of the entire game, mind you, just that it's what I think it does the best. Another thing that the game does really well is the items. Both games, in fact. The items in Seasons are mostly focused on combat, which makes sense given the minimal focus on puzzles that the game has. Much like Link's Awakening, the shield is once again an equipable item that takes a button slot, and once again I find that incredibly annoying, so I never really use the shield that much. Otherwise, it's a pretty solid selection. Rock's Feather is cool as always. The Ember Seeds and Slingshot spice up the combat and make it a little more interesting. The other seeds are also pretty interesting, with fun and unique properties that also spice up the combat. There's a nice progression path for the majority of items here, which is a really simple way to make them feel more important. The best item is obviously the magnetic gloves. These things are so cool, being able to take off armor of enemies or move Link either toward or away from magnetic poles, as well as the ability to push, pull, or otherwise move items in different ways. I love these things, and it's a shame that the closest we ever got to seeing them in a 3D game was with Magnesis in Breath of the Wild, but even then, it only manipulates metal objects and Link can't be attracted to or repelled from those objects like here. Maybe one day. One last thing to note about the game in this section of the video that I think is relevant, since it's something that I've mentioned in every one of my Zelda videos and will be something that I continue to mention in every game that has one, Oracle of Seasons has a trading sequence. However, how this game treats the trading sequence makes it arguably the best one in the entire series. First off, beating the game is not locked behind it, which makes going through it feel a lot better since it's easy to ignore it if you don't want to do it. But more importantly is the fact that it doesn't even matter if you do it or not. Your reward for doing the quest is the Nobleman's Sword, but the game tells you the Lost Woods combination so that if you remember it on future playthroughs, you can get it right away if you remember it. This makes the quest still have value while still meaning that on future playthroughs you don't have to go through the tedium of it all over again on subsequent playthroughs. I don't feel the need to really go in depth with any problems or whatever since it's entirely optional. It truly is a wonderful mercy that the game bestows upon you. Overall, Oracle of Seasons Overworld is fairly laid back and encourages exploration of its world far more than the mere action label might initially lead you to believe. It's probably the third best overworld of the 2D games in my opinion, being neck and neck with Koholint Island, still can't decide which I like more, and just under Phantom Hourglass. We'll get to that one when we get to that video. It is unfortunately the game's strongest element and it's all downhill from here, but only by like a foot at most. Oracle of Ages looks pretty dang solid for a Game Boy game. The sprite work is pretty solid, everything is appealing to look at, the visuals are nice, I'm running out of things to say. Was that deja vu? An allusion to the time travel mechanics present in the game since that's what I said in the previous section? Or is it simply lazy writing? I'll let you decide. Hint, it's the last option. The music in this game is also kind of average, much like its counterpart, and spoilers for the Minish Cap video, but this is an unfortunate trend with all three of the Capcom games. So, this game is more definitively focused on the puzzle aspects of Zelda, and my goodness is this the perfect Zelda game for me. The main mechanic that they use is time travel, which is heavily expanded on from Ocarina of Time. On a basic level, it's essentially just the Dark World concept, except it's the distant past and the present, which does actually create enough of an aesthetic difference that it feels fairly distinct. They use this mechanic to its fullest potential. It's used in and out of dungeons and requires that you keep a mental map of not only the current map in your mind, but the other time periods layout as well, which in and of itself already leads to really good puzzle solving potential, but it also makes navigation itself a puzzle, with the mere act of getting from point A to B being fairly taxing on my primitive ape brain. And this bleeds over into more areas than just main story progression. Mobbable walls are often inaccessible and require you to think out of the box when using the time travel in order to finally access them. Even the secrets require more than just exploring the overworld. Labyrinth, as the name would suggest, is a giant labyrinth, a puzzle box that you slowly solve over the course of the game. There's no element of this experience that isn't attached to a puzzle of some kind. The intensity of the puzzles is also handled fairly well, with them easing you into the more complex nature of this game's puzzles. It starts out with you merely needing to travel to the past and do a light bit of exploration to obtain the mystery seeds, and it's fairly basic up until you need to get to the third dungeon where you need a raft, which requires rope, and the rope is made by some guy who hasn't even made it yet, which means that you need to go on a detour to the graveyard where you'll find the rope, as well as the sword flipper so you can finally get your raft made. Except not really, because you need to get a map from some weird guy, and the thought of not having played Majora's Mask or Wind Waker before this game makes me pity you, since then you would only know to look for someone who is quote-unquote weird. Once you finally get your map, you then get all your stuff stolen by these based lizard people, which leads you to this incredible puzzle where you have to trade certain items to gain access to others to get stuff so that you can have all of your items, before finally getting to the third dungeon, which is where the dungeons start to get really complex. And it doesn't let up at all as you progress throughout the rest of the game. To get to the final dungeon, you need to find this one Zora in the past who will let you through to the Sea of Storms since you received a Zora skill for beating the previous dungeon, where you then need to find a pirate ship where you give the Zora skill to the pirate captain to obtain an eyeball, which has you needing to go back to Crescent Island to find the head statue to place the eyeball inside so that you can have your courage, wisdom, and power tested with combat, invisible pathways, etc. After this, you proceed into some ancient ruins where you're swarmed with enemies. After taking care of them, you then need to navigate this twisting, winding path before finally gaining access to the ancient tomb. And that's just an abridged version. This focus on puzzles makes the entire map feel claustrophobic, not helped with its size. When you beat the game, it is immensely satisfying because it feels like you just solved the ultimate puzzle. However, for as much as I love the puzzles in this game, the overworld is not the best element of the game. The dungeons, where most Zelda games condense their puzzles, is where Ages shines the brightest. Dungeons are these tightly contained areas. It's easier to get a grasp on their size and keep a mental map than it is to keep a mental map of an entire overworld, which you kind of have to do if you want to have any hope of making progress. The overworld here does feel like one massive dungeon, in a way that even Skyward Sword's bleeding of dungeon design into its overworld didn't do. Even if the individual puzzles that make up that pseudo-dungeon aren't as complicated as in the proper ones, it doesn't suddenly stop Labyrinth from feeling like a huge game-wide dungeon. It gets kind of exhausting to play a lot quicker than pretty much any other entry in the series. Not exactly helping with this is how complex the puzzles can be a lot of the time, which only makes me want to stop playing a lot sooner since the mental energy drains my primitive 76% evolved brain, which has 24% less power efficiency. It's definitely not the kind of game that I can play to relax. The items here are used fairly well and are all basically here to amplify the puzzles, as you could probably have guessed by this point. There's a bit of overlap with some of Oracle of Seasons items, and it goes to show how versatile those items are and how they work in the context of both types of games. The focus on upgrades is still as cool as ever, since it still allows the items to get more mileage while still giving the dungeons good progression. Though the sword and shield upgrades aren't nearly as substantial in Ages due to the minimized focus on combat this time around, compared to Seasons where it was a really great reward. There are two particular items that I think especially stand out here, the Siege Shooter and the Switch Hook. The Siege Shooter is essentially a different take on the Slingshot from Seasons. It's also versatile, with the seeds being able to ricochet off the walls, hit switches, light torches, or even hurt enemies. This makes it an incredibly useful item and one of my favorites in the series. The Switch Hook is probably the most interesting take on the hookshot I've ever seen, and I'm surprised that no other Zelda game tried to innovate on the item in any way other than just giving you another one. It allows you to switch places with certain blocks when traversing holes or whatever else you'd use a hookshot for. While a small change on the surface, this actually opens up more puzzle opportunities than if they had just done their usual fare with it. Even the dreaded trading sequence in this game is kind of fun since you have to trade items in both the past and the present, though I'd argue that it isn't as good as its counterpart in this regard. After removing a headstone that prevents a Poe from moving on to the afterlife, you're given the Poe Clock, which is then traded with a postman in the past to receive the stationery, which is traded for the stink bag with the mysterious toilet hand, which then has you needing to go back to the present to trade it for the tasty meat on Crescent Island, which then leads you to get the doggy mask from the Happy Mask salesman, which then leads you to the present day Lena City to get the dumbbell from Mamamuyan, where you then have to travel to the past to find a skinny guy who wants to get buff, allowing you to get the cheesy mustache, which you give to a present-day comedian, who tells you a funny joke, which you then pass along to a depressed boy who gives you the touching book in return for making him laugh, which you then give to Maple, who gives you the magic ore, which you then use to get the sea ukulele by giving it to someone who needs another ore to row in the race, which you then give to an old Zora musician who then in return gives you the broken sword, which if you successfully complete the mini game, you can get the noble sword or master sword depending on if you're playing a linked game or not. This is one of the very few times that I would say that the trading sequence is actually fun in one of these games, mostly because of the puzzle solving as I mentioned. I do think that it's not quite as good as Seasons due to the fact that you can't just skip the whole thing if you don't want to deal with it. Overall, the Overworld in Ages is pretty dang solid, and its dedication to puzzles, despite how overwhelming it can sometimes be, is admirable and makes it a wonderful brain teaser throughout its entire runtime. The dungeons in these games are easily where the differences in design philosophy shine the brightest. Both sets of dungeons have their own strengths with what they focus on. Ages having some of the most perplexing navigation and best puzzles of any dungeon in the entire series, while Seasons does a really good job at merging the chaotic combat-focused dungeons of the original Zelda with a new format introduced in A Link to the Past. What you are then left with are some of the most phenomenal dungeon experiences in the entire 2D catalog. There isn't a set of dungeons from any other 2D Zelda game that matches the brilliance of these two games. And while I think that the overworld is the strongest part of Seasons, that's not to say that the dungeons are even remotely close to bad, just that I enjoy the overworld a bit more. Unlike my other Zelda retrospectives where I briefly talk about every dungeon individually, I found that I had a hard time doing that. So instead I'll talk more about how each of the dungeons progress from one to the next. None of the dungeons in Oracle of Seasons are that complex, which works for what the game wants to be. The dungeons are a lot more open-ended, focused on physical keys and locks in comparison to progression being locked off by the architecture of the dungeon itself. None of them are focused on figuring out how to progress, but rather what you do on the progression path. As such, I don't have much to say about a lot of the dungeons in this game in comparison to its counterpart. Gnarled Root Dungeon is fairly small and is a nice warm-up to the rest of the dungeons. Snake's Remains is a lot bigger and more expansive. It has more combat encounters, but despite its scope, it never really asks you to think about the layout of the dungeon, which is definitely a nice refresher after Oracle of Ages. It steadily progresses this design idea for the next few dungeons, with them getting bigger and more challenging combat encounters. Unicorn's Cave opens with a series of connected screens, none of them being obstructed by a wall or locked door. Had this been designed with Ages in mind, then it would have played a lot more with its layout. Just looking at the map from a bird's eye view, it seems like it would be complicated, but it's only as tricky as the micro puzzles that reside within it. The Ancient Ruins expands on this even further. It's gigantic and incredibly open. It even has a dial, a rotating wheel that changes the direction toward where you just came from when you step on it. Ages uses them to make progression more difficult, and its inclusion in Seasons would seem to do the same thing. And while it kind of does, with the less constricted nature of the dungeon, it's a lot easier to enter it from different sides. It does promote some level of macro-level thinking, but it's not so much that it undercuts the main focus of the dungeon design. It's mostly there to bring back a bit of the puzzle flavor from the other dungeons in the series. Sword and Shield Maze is the natural culmination of Seasons dungeon design. It's huge and sprawling. There's even one massive room in the center of the lower floor, the sword part. It has the most difficult combat encounters, and while it pales in comparison to Ages, it does have the trickiest progression of any dungeon in the game. Told you I didn't have much to say about them. They are fun, but it's hard for me to really talk about what I like about them. Is it enough to say that I simply just enjoy them for what they are with this surface level exploration of them? Hopefully it is. The bosses in Oracle of Seasons focus much more on combat than those of Ages. It's much more about reflex and timing, and I really enjoy the vast majority of them, especially in comparison to the pitiful offerings of Link's Awakening. Aquamentus is an evolution of the original fight from the first game, the only weak point being its horn. It's a much better fight than previously, and a good first boss. Dodongo has you needing to throw a bomb into its mouth when it opens to try and breathe out fireballs to attack Link. But the bomb doesn't actually do any damage, it merely makes the Dodongo unable to move briefly, so you have to pick him up and throw him onto the spiked floor. It's a nice subversion that absolutely improves the fight and prevents it from becoming blindingly simple. Mothula has you needing to avoid all of his attacks before he lands on one of the outer platforms, where you then need to jump over to him and do some damage. It's simple but fun. Goma has you needing to avoid getting grabbed by its giant claw. Once that's taken care of, you need to avoid its other attacks as it moves around the room before briefly opening its eye, allowing you to use the slingshot to kill it. While not as fun as the previous bosses, it's still decent nonetheless. Digdogger will jump around the room, with you needing to use the magnetic gloves to move the spiked ball in the corner of the room into him. It's not the strongest fight in the world, but I still think that it's a fun use of the dungeon item. Manhandla has you needing to use the boomerang to take care of its 4 heads that are constantly shooting out projectiles before hitting its body. You have to constantly be on the move, and it's a very fun challenge. Gleeok has you needing to avoid his heads and then using Rock's cape to avoid getting paralyzed by its attack in the second phase. It's not as mechanically interesting as some of the other bosses, but it's still a fun time overall. Medusa Head has you needing to avoid its orbs that turn you into stone for a few seconds, all while waiting for a good opportunity to use your hyper slingshot to stun it, allowing you to attack it with your sword. I share these same thoughts here that I do with Gleeok. Onox is the final boss of the game, wielding a large ball and chain that you need to hit him with a spin attack. Eventually, he'll use Din as a barrier that deals damage to Link if he hits her, meaning that you need to use the Rod of Seasons to get her out of the way. It's a wonderful challenge to avoid his attacks, deal with Din, all while trying to get some hits in. In the second phase, he becomes the Dark Dragon. He has a variety of attacks, spitting blue fire at Link, sweeping his hand across the ground, and trying to slam his hands into Link. You have to avoid all these attacks, and then when he slams his hand onto the ground, you need to jump on it and hit the jewel on his head. Not only is his design really cool, it's just a really fun fight and the perfect capper to a set of surprisingly decent bosses. Now onto the dungeons I have something to say about. The dungeons in Oracle of Ages are all complex and intricately designed pieces of architecture that test your brain more than anything else. As such, I have a bit more to say about them. Spirit's Grave is a pretty decent first dungeon, though it isn't anything too amazing. The amount of complexity here isn't too high, even compared to other games' first dungeons. That's not to say that it's bad or anything, though. There are a few bits of clever game design here. For instance, this first colored block pushing puzzle brilliantly and subtly teaches you about how the main mechanic will work. This is expanded upon greatly in later dungeons, and there are a few bits of navigation that can be just a little tricky. There's really not that much else to the dungeon though. The Wing dungeon steps up the progression by introducing how time travel will be utilized with the dungeons. It is strange how it crumbles by merely lifting a rock, but that's just life, you know? Anyway, already at the second dungeon, Ages shows its devious puzzles. The navigation here is somewhat confusing, but not so much as to overwhelm the player with what is merely the second dungeon. I like this statue puzzle where you can only move the statues when you make this upper tile the same color as the statues you want to move. It's a fun idea and not immediately obvious that it's the case. Moonlit Grotto is when the dungeons start becoming more complex, primarily with the introduction of dials, which means that in order to progress to other parts of the dungeon, you need to navigate to another side of the wheel. While the navigation here isn't anywhere near as complex as later dungeons, as there's only one of them here, it's still fairly confusing, and it tells you that you need to think about the layout of the dungeon as a whole in the future if you want to make any progress. Skull Dungeon is massive, with tons of tricky puzzles, and I like how the minecart get more interesting use here. There are a few issues with this one, however. For instance, if you get killed by the boss and aren't using save states or playing on original hardware, then you have to go through the entire dungeon again, since it's a much more efficient path than the teleporter, which is kind of an issue when the entire thing is made up of a massive winding path. All the traps and enemies reset too, so every single death requires that you basically go through the entire dungeon all over again, which makes dying to this boss one of the worst feelings of any Nintendo game. The Crown Dungeon utilizes these crystals that raise and lower the blocks depending on the color, and it affects a lot of the dungeon, which makes you explore the dungeon to see what it affects before hitting it. It starts actively punishing players who just blindly wander from room to room. It forces them to engage with the dungeon and its mechanics if they want to solve it, and I really appreciate that. Mermaid's Cave once again introduces time travel into its puzzle progression, this time being even more complicated than when it was used earlier. It's not entirely obvious that you even need to do so. It's something that would only cross your mind when you're stuck for like half an hour. On top of this, it finally sees the return of dials, two of them being right next to each other. Jabu Jabu's Belly does the most delightful thing imaginable by introducing the changing of water levels just like the Water Temple. Much like the Water Temple, I think that it is a phenomenal challenge, though it is a bit harder to judge the depth perception of water in this game compared to Ocarina. Even outside of this, progression between the rooms is somewhat tricky with how gargantuan it is. The Ancient Tomb takes the dials to their logical extreme. There may only be two of them in the entire dungeon, much like Mermaid's Cave, but unlike that one, these ones are a bit more spread out. It also expands on the confusing progression that comes from the crystals. It also has 3 massive floors. It's the culmination of all the game's most devious macro-level puzzles. You need to think about how the dungeon as a whole is constructed and how the different rooms are connected together. Overall, the dungeons here are pretty good at offering a wonderful puzzling experience. The bosses in Oracle of Ages carry over the puzzle elements in an interesting way. Because this is a Game Boy Color game we're talking about, many of them require an interesting solution in order to beat them, and on the whole, I actually kind of prefer these fights to the one from Oracle of Seasons, despite this not even being the action-adventure game. That being said, even though it has higher highs, it also has lower lows, but on the whole, they feel like a step up. Pumpkinhead is a pathetically easy boss, his attacks can never hurt you, and damaging him takes no thought or effort. Head Thwomp is absolutely miserable to fight. In fact, he's up there with the 3DS version of Molduga and the stupid Octorok and Ocarina of Time's Jabu Jabu Belly as one of my least favorite bosses in the entire series. The way that you need to defeat him is by throwing bombs into his head. There are 2 major issues that make him an absolute chore to fight. Firstly, you're one tile short of throwing a bomb from this edge platform. Turns out I'm an idiot and you can throw the bomb from this tile. I was just unable to in my playthrough, so I assumed that it was impossible. A lot of what I say about the boss still stands though, just that one thing doesn't. So you have to use these platforms circling around him, which wouldn't be that much of an issue if it weren't for the fact that you can only throw bombs if you move, and there's not that much room to move here. But by far the biggest issue is that you can only do damage to him if you hit him when his face is red. And since he shifts between faces all the time, it means that you have to miraculously be in the optimal position at the correct time, as well as hoping that you throw your bomb at the precise right time. This becomes an incredibly annoying task as you have to completely rely on the rotating platforms, which won't always be in the correct position to do it. You also only have 2 cycles because then you'll start shooting a bunch of fireballs around the room, making it nearly impossible impossible to focus on damaging the boss because you'll be too busy trying to not die. The fight takes so unbelievably long and not a single second of it is fun. Shadow Hag is a pretty fun fight with you having to use the wall to ricochet a seed into the boss. It's not the most difficult thing in the world, however, it's pretty enjoyable. Eyesore is a fine fight. Take out a few of these mini boys and then slash at the main boy with the switch hook. Not too terribly interesting, but still fun. The Great Moblin simply asks you to avoid the smaller bombs that the regular boring Moblins throw at you, and then throw the big bomb back at him. It's fine enough for what it is and is fairly fun. Smog is inferior to the dragon from the classic book by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Hobbit, but it's superior to the dragon featured in Peter Jackson's The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smog. This fight is actually just straight up a puzzle, unlike the others where there was a brief moment of figuring out what you needed to do in order to damage them. You need to join the miniatures together in order to damage him, and it's actually pretty tricky to figure out. Octagon is all about how you position Link, with you needing to find the sweet spots that he can't hit you, but you can hit him. It can be a little monotonous at times, but I think that overall he's a fairly solid boss. Plasmarine has you needing to switch with him in order for him to get damaged by his own attack, which is a brilliant idea for a boss involving the switch hook. It's a really fun boss, and I always look forward to refighting him on every revisit to the game. Ramrock has 4 phases, which does mean that he drags out a bit. Thankfully, I do think that each of the phases is generally pretty fun, so it doesn't feel as long as it is. The first phase sees you needing to hit his arms back at him, which requires careful aim and is generally pretty fun. The second phase has you needing to get him to clasp onto bombs instead of Link, which is a fairly basic task that's still somewhat enjoyable. The third phase has you needing to use a seed shooter to hit him in the back since he'll be guarding his front. And the last phase sees you needing to grab onto one of the chain balls he throws at you before flinging it back at him. Overall, a pretty satisfying and varied boss. Varen is a boss that you fight at 2 points in the game, once following Mermaid's Cave and then again at the end. The first fight combines the use of the seed shooter and switch hook to hit her and switch places with Nehru to attack her with your sword. It's a fairly decent fight. The second fight involves multiple phases. The first phase is a reprise of the previous battle. The second phase has you needing to charge a spin attack and then time it in order to hit her as she flies across the screen. The third phase has her shifting into various forms that are a bit less straightforward to deal with. She'll turn into a turtle where you need to attack her head, a bee where you just have to avoid her attacks and slash at her with your sword, or a spider that shoots webs at Link with you needing to launch a bomb into her face before attacking with a sword. It is a little disappointing that, in comparison to Ramrock, the progression of the boss isn't as interesting. Each of these ideas are a little too disconnected, to the point that I almost feel like Ramrock would have been a more mechanically satisfying fight to end the game on. And it's not even a question that Onox is the better final boss. Still though, she's a good boss and a decent end to the game. At least that would be the case if you were a loser who didn't get the other game. Let's link the games together now and talk about them both simultaneously. It feels weird having the last major section of one of my Zelda videos not ending on me talking about the dungeons and bosses, but for these games, it didn't feel like I could have done it any other way. We're going to be talking about a couple of the elements that are basically impossible to mention when talking about the games individually without either repeating myself wholesale or not even being able to properly go into my full thoughts, as well as the true final boss of the game. First off, the ring system. I think that this is one of my favorite collectibles in the entire series. It's kind of similar to the badge system from Skyward Sword, though I would argue that it's handled a bit better here in my opinion. First off, there are over 50 rings, which gives a lot of subtle variety to the gameplay, from increasing damage taken, but also giving your sword more damage, to giving you a good punch when nothing is equipped, to increasing specific items and weapons damage output, to auto-recovering hearts, increasing swimming speed, taking half damage from specific traps and obstacles, making all damage taken being 1 heart, etc. The key word here though is subtle. They have just enough value to make them a satisfying reward in their own right, but they don't make the game so radically different that it feels as though you have to get them. It also gives value to rupees, since you have to spend them to appraise the rings in the first place. It's one of the few Zelda games that actually gives substantial value to rupees, thus making them also feel like a nice reward. There's also an element of RNG to the system. While not every rings follows this system, a lot of them do. And while that has the potential to be really annoying, the fact that outside of the cursed ring it's something that you would probably want, it never gets in the way of wanting to go out of your way to find them. Plus, it also allows for every playthrough to feel slightly unique, since the odds of getting the exact same rings again are astronomically low. Animal buddies from Kirby's Dream Land 2 also make an appearance here as well. That's a funny little haha for those who don't get the joke. All 3 expand Link's moveset in interesting ways that make the world feel a bit more engaging to explore. Moosh is a bear that allows you to hover over the ground for a bit, letting you cross holes in the ground. He also has a ground pound that can clear enemies within its radius. Ricky is a based kangaroo who's a bit more combat focused with his abilities being that he can punch things either normally or with a charged punch. He can also climb steep cliffs and jump over small holes. Dimitri is the only buddy that is a species specific to the Zelda series, that being a Dodongo, and he definitely opens up the world more than the other two, allowing you to traverse deep water, as well as the ability to scale waterfalls. They don't get a ton of development, as is the standard Zelda practice, but I do enjoy the slight gameplay shakeup that they offer. And then there's a thing that the section is named after, linking the games together. After you beat the game, you get a password that you can enter in the other game to continue the story. I'll talk about the story at the end of this section. I wanted to focus on how this affects the gameplay first. The next game that you play will begin with 4 heart containers and a sword, which gets you into the gameplay a lot sooner. There's also a lot of other goodies that you can access, ranging from heart containers to rings. You can also carry over rings and passcodes you received from the previous game you played to access other stuff. I do think that they could have maybe pushed the linked game system a little further in terms of gameplay differences, but what we have here is still fine. My favorite thing about the linked games is how the second game you play references what you did in the previous adventure, with some characters even returning, thus intertwining the games. They do some really neat stuff here, like bringing over a child you formed a connection with and watched grow in ages become a shy adult in Seasons, or Queen Ambi touring Holodrum, where you learned that the tower she built for her husband's journey home was the pirate captain the whole time, or Zelda aiding the townspeople. Easter eggs like this really makes the world of both games feel more alive and fun. I think that linking the games together is fully justified by these smaller details alone, and it's part of the reason that I'm not as bummed by the minimal effect it has on the gameplay. It does make me wonder how the elusive third game would have worked in the equation though. It makes sense why it was simplified to just 2 games. Even just linking the 3 games together would have been a really complicated ordeal, since you could start with any of the 3 games, then move on to either of the other 2 games in any order, which gives at least 15 different scenarios that they would have to write for without taking into consideration the unique characters and plot points of all 3 games on an unlinked playthrough. Then there's how gameplay progression would carry over from one game to the next. It honestly sounds like a nightmare trying to turn that idea into a reality, even though if it did happen, it would probably have been the coolest thing. Alright, it's time to stop procrastinating and actually talk about the narratives now. I think that the story of these games are perfectly serviceable. Being the first 2D Zelda games after Link's Awakening's fantastic yet simple narrative, it's a little disappointing how basic these stories are. That's not to say that Zelda has super deep and complex narratives on average, but compared to the heights of the best stories in the series, which either focus on some grand adventure, like Twilight Princess or Skyward Sword, or a specific theme like Link's Awakening and Majora's Mask, to go to these, it's just a little underwhelming. And again, Link's Awakening was an OG Game Boy game, so there's really no excuse. Season's story is really basic, just setting up Onox as the big bad who kidnaps Din and then sends Holodrum into a strange fluctuation of seasons. Otherwise, there's not much to grab onto outside of the Easter eggs from Ages, and that's assuming that you played Ages beforehand, which there's only a 50% probability of having happened. And while more stuff does happen in Ages, it's still a mostly boring story that only really engaged me with specific moments, like how the tree guide falls in love with Link over the course of the game, which is pretty fun. Or having to undo the evil that Varin has caused all over the world, like poisoning Zora's domain's water, stuff like that. It's far more stimulating than Seasons for sure, but I also think that your reason for going from area to area isn't really that well justified, unlike nearly every Zelda game from A Link to the Past onward. The final story segment is really the only interesting point of the stories of either game. You are sent to Twin Rova, who are the real villains the whole time, where you then engage in a final battle with Ganon. Zelda kisses Link and he's proclaimed the ultimate hero or whatever. It's fine enough, it doesn't ruin the games or anything, it's just that coming after 3 games that all have fantastic stories, it's not hard to think of this as a significant downgrade. The last thing to talk about before we wrap this video up is the final boss encounter. The first phase sees you attacking Katake and Kaume, with the second phase seeing them combining into Twin Rova. And Ocarina of Time, this is not. In that game, they're one of my favorite bosses in the series. Here though, I'm not really that big a fan of the fight. Like, it's fine, but it's not nearly as good as its 3D counterpart. You just need to hit the ice ball into the fire twin and vice versa for the fireball. Twin Rova just has you needing to avoid her attacks while shooting her with scent seeds. It's decently fun, I suppose, but it's nowhere near as interesting or fun as how it was previously. After the fight, they sacrifice themselves to resurrect Ganon. This fight is essentially the same evolution of the basic fight from A Link to the Past. He'll slash at Link with his trident, shoot either 1 large orb, 3 large orbs, or many smaller orbs, all of which you need to avoid. Attacking him requires you to charge a spin attack when he's off screen, and then hitting him when he appears. It's a fun way of merging the 2 different aspects of boss design with a slight puzzle you need to figure out while still testing your skills. I think it's a pretty solid way to close out the 2 games, and he's absolutely one of my favorite Ganon fights. This video has actually been really difficult to write the script for, so let's wrap this thing up before I go insane. Together, the Oracle games offer a Zelda experience that can't easily be topped. But it's when looking at their individual strengths and how they blend together that the games truly become special. It's easy to lump them together and call it a day, but if you ignore Oracle of Ages, does Oracle of Seasons still hold up on its own? Does Ages hold up without the support of Seasons? The answer is a resounding yes. They each act as palate cleansers from the other. They are the yin and yang of the Zelda experience. Twilight Princess is my favorite Zelda game because it takes the classic Zelda formula and perfects it. Everything that I love about Zelda is encapsulated by that game. The same is true of the Oracle games, though in a different context. They each take a different half of the series and build an entire adventure off of that. And it works flawlessly. Individually, they stand as puzzles personified and adventure personified. Apart, they offer a fantastic Zelda experience in their own right. Together, they make for the pinnacle of what 2D Zelda can do. I still like other 2D Zeldas more, but from a critical lens, none of them could ever top the brilliance of these two Game Boy Color titles.